Okay, so today we're going deep on conservatism. And I know you're coming at this as a philosopher, right? So we're going to want to look at this through that lens. I mean, conservatism alongside liberalism and socialism, it's like one of the big three when it comes to political thought in the post-Enlightenment era, right?
Totally. And you've given us a super in-depth source for this deep dive.
Yeah.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on conservatism. So we're going to unpack the core tenets, like really dissect those. Then the historical development of conservatism, and of course, all the major philosophical arguments surrounding it.
Exactly. As a philosopher, I mean, you're always wrestling with these big ideas, like what's the nature of knowledge? How much can we rely on reason? What role does tradition play? And all these fundamental concepts, well, we're going to see how conservatism grapples with them. And I think you'll find some pretty surprising, even challenging insights there.
For sure. And we'll also touch on those popular understandings of conservatism, how they sometimes clash with the more nuanced philosophical characterizations, especially that idea that conservatism is all about rejecting reason, that skepticism about abstract thought. Well, we're gonna dig into that. You've given us this rich philosophical overview, and we want to explore the parts that really resonate with your training and your curiosity.
Right. Now, one of the first things that jumps out from the encyclopedia is this distinction between like a broad sense of conservatism and a narrower, more self-conscious one.
Right. So you have folks like Cecil who talk about this broader view, almost like it's a universal human thing, this resistance to change. We like what's familiar, what we know, like maybe even Clarendon, looking back at the English Civil War, there's this unease with massive upheavals, right? But then you have the narrower view, the one that becomes like a real intellectual project after the Enlightenment.
Right. And that narrower conservatism, people often connect that with Burke, right?
Absolutely. Thinkers like Beiser, especially looking at the German context, they point to this self-conscious conservatism as like a direct response to the Enlightenment, specifically that focus on reason. And of course, the French Revolution, that was huge. And here's the key thing. Philosophically speaking, this isn't just a vague preference for the status quo. It's a developed intellectual position.
Okay. And at the heart of it, this narrower conservatism, it's got this core characteristic, right? It's skeptical about how much you can rely on abstract reasoning in politics. Like it says, hey, we need to look at historical experience. We need to value what's embedded in traditions. Right there, that sets up an interesting philosophical debate, doesn't it? The encyclopedia mentions Skorupski and that distinction between pragmatic conservatism and rational conservatism.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, especially for someone coming from philosophy like yourself. So you have the pragmatic wing, Burke's the big name there. It's all about caution, taking things slow, looking at what's worked in the past, even if the theory behind it isn't always crystal clear. But then you have the rational conservatives, and they say, no, reason can lead us to conservative principles, like the importance of social order, the need for authority. So the big philosophical question there becomes, are conservative principles grounded in what we see working or in some deeper rational justification? It's a fundamental tone about how we even know stuff about politics, isn't it?
It's interesting, though, because you look at the sheer volume of philosophical work on liberalism and socialism and conservatism, it almost feels neglected in a way, right? Like Broad points out, it hasn't gotten the same kind of, philosophical attention. And even on a basic level, there's debate about what conservatism even is, right? Is it a full-blown ideology with like a fixed set of principles? Or is it more of a disposition, a way of looking at the world? That's how Graham and Nisbet seem to frame it.
Right. And that's a big deal for understanding conservatism philosophically, because, if it's mostly a disposition, this inherent suspicion of too much abstract thinking in politics, then it's almost like it's resisting philosophical analysis itself. Philosophy usually wants things to be like clearly defined. We want logical arguments, principles that apply universally. But conservatism, with this built-in resistance to being, systematized, it might explain why we don't see those huge philosophical treatises on it like we do with liberalism or socialism.
And you can't ignore the historical context here either, can you? The encyclopedia is pretty clear that modern conservatism, the self-aware kind, it's largely a reaction to the Enlightenment, right? Mm-hmm. Especially that emphasis on reason. And of course, the French Revolution, it was just such a huge event. Like Gray makes that point pretty strongly.
Yeah. The Enlightenment was all about universal principles, right?
Yeah.
Things we can figure out through reason. It had this optimistic view of humanity, like we can use reason to create a perfect society. That's the backdrop against which conservatism defines itself. And then the French Revolution, it's like this cautionary tale for conservatives, a perfect example of what happens when reason in politics, it just runs wild.
Now, before we get to Burke, and he's definitely the main guy here, the encyclopedia does mention these proto-conservatives, thinkers, and traditions that kind of foreshadow some of the later conservative ideas.
Yeah, that's important to remember. This isn't all brand new with Burke, right? Like, you see some of it in Aristotle, how he emphasizes practical experience in politics. It's not just theory for him. It's about what you do. And then Confucius, he's all about authority, social order, hierarchy. That resonates a lot with later conservative thinkers.
And then you get closer to the Enlightenment, and there's the English common law tradition, right? The focus on precedent, the idea that wisdom is like accumulated over time. Figures like Coke were big on that. And even the Tories in England, like Sherlock, they're focused on preserving the existing forms of government. It's like they're laying the groundwork, right?
Yeah, and Hume's a really interesting case. Philosophically speaking, I mean, he's this huge skeptic, right? Doubting the power of reason, especially when it comes to figuring out like ultimate goals, ultimate values. That definitely has some conservative vibes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But his relationship to conservatism is complicated. I mean, he comes before the French Revolution, and that event, it really crystallizes what conservatism is all about. You know, that quote from Dr. Johnson about Hume being a Tory by chance. It captures it perfectly. Hume, he had this philosophical temperament that lined up with some conservative ideas, but he didn't have that specific historical political context.
But in terms of conservatism becoming this clear, self-aware philosophical position, it really seems like Burke and his critique of the French Revolution, it's just essential.
Definitely. Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, it's like the founding text of conservatism. He lays out this detailed analysis. He warns about utopianism, how dangerous it is to rely on abstract theory that's not grounded in reality. He was amazingly accurate, predicting the reign of terror, the rise of Napoleon, and that analysis, it became so influential for generations of conservative thinkers.
And the thing is, the relationship between conservatism and the Enlightenment, it's not simple. You can't just say conservatism rejects modernity, right? Like Scruton has made the point that conservatism is a form of modernism. It's trying to make sense of the present with all its flaws and complexities. And Gray even called Oakeshott an uncompromising modernist, right?
Right, and that's a crucial nuance. It wasn't about, going back in time. It was about engaging with modernity on its own terms, but doing it in a way that valued continuity, that respected the wisdom of tradition, and acknowledged that abstract reason. When you apply it to the real world of politics and society, well, it has its limits. Like Pocock makes this interesting point that Burke actually saw himself as defending what he called an enlightened Europe against the excesses of revolutionary thought. It's almost like a battle within the Enlightenment, a debate about how reason should be applied.
And Burke points out something important, too. He says that sometimes people have misunderstood Burke's opposition to attacks on religion as this all-out, anti-Enlightenment crusade. But that wasn't it at all. Burke's skepticism, it wasn't a total rejection of reason. It was a very specific critique of a certain type of abstract radical rationalism that he thought was really dangerous in politics.
Yeah, exactly. And the encyclopedia brings up this ongoing debate among historians. When did conservatism actually become a distinct ideology? Jones argues it happened later in the late 19th century when Burke really solidified as like the conservative thinker. But Clark, he says it happened earlier in the 1830s. But by then, the social and political world had changed so much, it was really hard to apply Burke's ideas directly from, the 18th century.
So this brings us to, I think, what's really at the core of Burkean conservatism and something that a philosopher would really find interesting, that deep skepticism about abstract reason in politics.
Definitely. Both O'Hear and Cakes, they point to this skepticism as like the foundation. It's a huge contrast with liberalism and socialism where there's this faith in a priori reasoning. You can figure out how to organize society, how to reform things just by thinking about it, by pure logic. But conservatism, the Burkean kind, it says, no, we need to look at what we've actually experienced. We need to be careful, make changes slowly, step by step.
And Burke himself, he lays out this skepticism so clearly. He rejects those abstract ideas of natural rights, the kind that the Jacobins were all about. They wanted to tear down society and rebuild it from scratch, all based on these abstract principles.
And epistemologically speaking, what's really fascinating is that Burke believed there's this kind of practical wisdom that's built into established institutions. It's not always something you can like write down in a theory or justify beforehand with logic. It's knowledge that's been, accumulated over time, passed down through culture and history.
And this suspicion of abstract reason, it leads to a really stark contrast with Jacobinism, right? The encyclopedia is right on the money when it says that ideologically they are like polar opposites.
Totally. The Jacobins, they embrace this political rationalism. They're willing to sacrifice the present for a utopian future that's been, designed according to these abstract principles. That's the complete opposite of the conservative emphasis on continuity, gradual change, and respect for the complexity of how society actually works. And you even see it in how they viewed revolutions. Conservatives often look at the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, and they see it as a restoration, like going back to a previous state of order, not this radical overthrow based on some blueprint. That's how they see the French Revolution.
And the encyclopedia has this interesting idea of conceptual holism. It's like conservatism, Jacobinism, liberalism, socialism. You can't really understand any of them in isolation. They make sense in relation to each other within this whole post-Enlightenment world.
Right. And there's that conservative critique of revolutionary utopianism. It's that willingness to sacrifice the present, the people living now, for the sake of this supposedly perfect future. That Trotsky quote where he's talking about destroying the existing order with blood and iron to make the individual sacred. It's a chilling example of what conservatives see as so dangerous and wrong-headed. And then you have figures like Schiller and Goethe. They're criticizing those French revolutionary ideals, and you see that fundamental clash.
And at the heart of it, it's this conservative view of society, not as some simple machine you can just redesign, but as this complex, interconnected organism, like Beiser puts it perfectly. Without the aid of experience, reason cannot prescribe political ideals that can be realized in practice.
Right. And because they see society as this organism, it leads them to what the encyclopedia calls particularist skepticism. Conservatives, they're really wary of applying these abstract, rational principles in every situation. They see the world as diverse, complex, full of different histories and circumstances. It's like that Burke quote, "I cannot praise or blame actions when stripped of all their circumstances. It's about context, context, context."
And Cobbin puts it well, too. He says, circumstances give every political principle its color.
And it's important to be clear here. This isn't like dictionary particularism, just being focused on your own little group. It's a more sophisticated philosophical position. It's kind of similar to moral particularism, where you're questioning whether you can just apply these universal rules in every situation. The encyclopedia makes it clear. Conservatives, they don't necessarily deny that general principles exist. They just have this deep skepticism about whether we as humans can really grasp them fully and apply them in a way that benefits everyone in every context. And Gray makes a really insightful point about our identities. He says they're largely given to us by histories we don't choose.
Yeah.
It highlights how much conservatives emphasize that we're, embedded in these specific social and historical contexts. And that puts limits on how much we can rely on purely rational or individualistic ways of understanding and organizing society.
And this kind of conservative skepticism, it's different from Cartesian skepticism, isn't it? I mean, they're not doubting the existence of the external world or whether our senses are reliable. Their skepticism is focused, it's aimed specifically at abstract theoretical reason, especially when you try to apply it to ethics and politics.
Exactly. It's about whether that kind of abstract reasoning can really guide political action, lead to, predictable good outcomes when it comes to social change. It's not like this fundamental critique of society the way, say, Marxist skepticism is. It's a different kind of skepticism. It's epistemological. It's about how we can understand and deal with the complexity of social and political order.
And then you have the whole issue of prejudice, right? That's often misunderstood. The encyclopedia helps clear it up. They explain that Burkean conservatives, they see prejudice, and they're using the original meaning there, like prejudgment, as this kind of wisdom that's embedded in tradition, built up over time. It's non-rational, meaning it doesn't come from like conscious logical deduction. But importantly, it's not necessarily irrational either.
Right. And Burke, he saw this kind of, I guess you could call it educated prejudice, as valuable, even necessary, especially when you have to act quickly, you don't have all the information, or you can't think through every possible outcome. It's about acting based on the experience of a whole community, something that's been passed down. You don't have to sit there and, calculate everything or come up with a rational explanation. So it's definitely non-rationalist, but not irrationalist.
And so the encyclopedia concludes that at its core, conservatism it's an epistemic stance. It's about how we know stuff, particularly when it comes to big values like justice and freedom. Conservatives, they believe in those values, but they're skeptical of abstract theories when it comes to figuring out how those values should work in practice.
Exactly. They want to understand those values in a concrete way, a way that's grounded in history, in the specific experiences and traditions of a particular society. They're suspicious of those abstract universal definitions. They see those as potentially, detached from reality and potentially disruptive if you apply them without being really, really careful.
So this skepticism about abstract reason in politics, it leads pretty naturally to another big characteristic of conservatism, that emphasis on tradition and the preference for gradual change. They don't like revolutions, do they?
Not really, no. And the encyclopedia is right to emphasize that conservatism isn't just about knee-jerk opposition to any kind of change. Burke himself said, really wisely, that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. It's all about how you change things. Conservatives want it to be slow, careful, based on what we've actually seen work. They're always aware that we don't know everything, and if we try to change society too quickly, based on some theory, well, there could be unintended consequences, and those are usually bad.
And central to this view is their respect for what's often called the tacit knowledge, the wisdom that they see embodied in those longstanding institutions. They look at those institutions and they see them as having evolved organically. They see those institutions, they hold the accumulated experience, the knowledge of so many generations, and that's something that reason alone can't really grasp or replicate.
And the encyclopedia makes an interesting point about the word tradition itself. It's a modern concept, really. It becomes important in the modern era, and it's often defined in contrast to modernity itself. Burke starts using the past as this powerful argument, this resource in political debates, and then you have this idea of the invention of tradition. Hobsbawm and Ranger explored that. It's sometimes these seemingly ancient traditions, they're actually pretty new. Or they've been reinvented, like Scott's work on Scotland, how some of those traditions aren't as old as people think. So tradition as a concept, it's complicated.
But even with that potential for manipulating tradition, conservatives still see these crucial political and social relationships as organic. They say they've grown slowly over time. Unlike reactionaries who want to go back to some past, whether it's real or imagined, conservatives generally see tradition as alive, something that's changing all the time, even if it's subtle. And they say it's best guided by careful reformers. Like Burke's view of those English revolutionaries in 1688, he saw them as restoring existing rights, not starting something totally new based on some abstract principles.
And Burke, he keeps coming back to this idea that good reform, it has to be practical, based on experience. He says, I must see with my own eyes, touch with my own hands, not only the fixed but the momentary circumstances, before I could venture to suggest any political project whatsoever. Really doesn't trust purely theoretical approaches to improving society.
And then you have Cakes, and he describes conservatism as this middle way between pure rationalism and blind faith, and he combines that with this pretty pessimistic view of human nature, like we're not perfectible. And this really fits that emphasis on gradualism, on the wisdom of experience. He's very clear. History, that's our best guide in politics.
And the encyclopedia is right to point out that this organic vision of society that conservatives have, it usually puts a lot of emphasis on institutions like the family, private property, religion. They see those as more fundamental to social order and how individuals flourish than a strong centralized state. It's different from that kind of state-centered organicism you see in the British idealists. And Cobham's point about Locke's influence in Britain, it helps explain why Locke, even though he emphasized organic development, he didn't go all the way to that kind of state-centered view.
And it's really important to keep in mind, and the encyclopedia makes this point, that reaction isn't the same as conservatism. Reactionaries, they want to go back to some past state. Conservatives generally accept that change is necessary, but it has to be gradual. And reactionaries, they're often authoritarian, right? They want to impose that past order. But conservatives, they emphasize local knowledge, the wisdom that communities have built up. They're often suspicious of distant, centralized bureaucracies.
Yeah, and their reliance on this idea of latent wisdom, it's really key. It's the idea that prejudice, instinct, long-standing customs, they hold a kind of intelligence, a practical intelligence, that goes beyond just conscious, rational thinking. That's how Kirk describes it. And customs, because they go back so far, they might seem static, but Pocock, he emphasizes that they're being tested all the time, refined by experience. But he's also cautious. He says we shouldn't try to completely reshape the state based on some fleeting intellectual trend or popular passion. Like Burke argued that those kinds of radical interventions, they could break the continuity, destroy the inherited wisdom of society.
Now, the encyclopedia then goes on to make this helpful distinction between what it calls formal and substantive conservatism.
Correct.
It helps us understand how it relates to other political ideologies, which, as a philosopher, I'm sure you're familiar with.
Right. And that's important because there are some misunderstandings about conservatism. It definitely has this pragmatic side. But if you say it's just pragmatism, like Gamble does, you're missing that it has this whole underlying philosophy. It has these specific assumptions about knowledge, society, human nature. And that distinction between relativistic and non-relativistic conservatism, that's really helpful in understanding how conservatism can actually be a coherent philosophical position.
Okay, so with the relativistic view, it's like a conservative would just try to improve whatever system is already in place, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's socialist, feudal, whatever. They'd use the specific experiences and values of that society, focus on gradual improvement, and respect what's developed organically.
Right. But non-relativistic conservatism, it rejects systems that are built around one single abstract principle, like a completely socialist state or a pure libertarian society or a totalitarian regime based on some rigid ideology. They'd say that a society without deep traditions, without the ability to change gradually based on experience, well, couldn't even be conservative. And James Mill, he had this famous critique of Burke. He said, just because something's old doesn't mean it's good. But that critique, it only really works against that more relativistic kind of conservatism.
And the key takeaway here is that non-relativistic conservatism, it has this implicit standard for what a good society is.
Right.
It has to be rooted in organically developed traditions. So something like a functioning totalitarian society, that would be like an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have that foundation of evolved traditions. It can't really change gradually and genuinely based on local knowledge and experience. So even within this seemingly particularist framework, there are these minimally rational, universalizable aspects. And then you have Keeks, and he says that the goal of conservatism is to preserve the political arrangements shown to be conducive to good lives. And that raises this huge philosophical question. What is a good life? And which political and social systems have actually shown that they can preserve it? That's, of course, a really, really debatable point. Like liberals, they might say individual freedom is essential for a good life, even if that means challenging or changing some traditions that they see as restrictive. And Graham has this point about conservative skepticism. He says it's not really about whether humans can be like morally perfect. It's more about whether we can actually know certain things in politics. It's an interesting nuance.
Mm-hmm.
But the encyclopedia is right when it says that in conservative thought, those two things, they're often really connected. Conservatives tend to have a more pessimistic view of human nature. We're flawed. We're selfish. Liberals and socialists are often more optimistic. They think humans are more malleable. We can be perfected. And those different views of human nature, they have a huge impact on how you see the possibilities of political and social change.
And Scruton's description of conservatism as imperfectionist, anti-utopian, and pragmatic, it fits perfectly with that more pessimistic view of human nature. And it also helps us see how conservatism is different from other ideologies that have these big, idealistic, utopian goals for how society should be transformed.
And the encyclopedia does a good job of separating conservatism from neoconservatism and libertarianism, which people often mix up.
Right, that's really important. The main differences are often about how they see state planning and economic intervention. Libertarians and a lot of neoconservatives, they tend to be against state planning in almost any form. Mm-hmm. They often base that on abstract ideas about individual liberty or the inherent efficiency of free markets. But Burkean conservatives, they're more pragmatic, more skeptical. They don't like to be tied to these rigid ideologies. So in certain cases, they might actually be okay with some state intervention if it's going to be effective in maintaining order or preserving some important tradition.
And Oakeshott had this great line about that. He said, "A plan to resist all planning." Well, it's just another form of that same rationalistic politics that it's supposed to be against. True conservatism, he says, it resists all forms of abstract rationalism. And that includes, that rigid ideological free market fundamentalism.
Yeah, and Scruton, he adds to that, he emphasizes that markets, they need to operate within existing customs, traditions, institutions. They
Yeah.
shouldn't be undermining them. It's similar to Adam Smith's view, which was more nuanced than a lot of people realize. Both Burke and Scruton, they're saying conservatism isn't mainly about economics, about maximizing efficiency or individual wealth. It's a much broader philosophy about society and politics. It's rooted in this long-term organic development of a specific society in a specific place and time.
The encyclopedia also points out that this kind of nuanced Burkean conservatism, it's been kind of fading away in U.S. and U.K. conservative parties, right? You see more of this assertive anti-government stance, which is closer to libertarianism, and a lot of focus on patriotic or religious positions. And it's important to note that neoconservatives, they don't always want a smaller state, right? They often want to redirect state power, especially when it comes to things like national defense and security.
And even though they might seem similar on the surface, Nozick's libertarianism, it's fundamentally different from conservatism. It's definitely not some conservative alternative to Rawls' liberalism. Nozick relies on these universal abstract principles, like his entitlement theory of justice. And that clashes with that core conservative aversion to universal abstract frameworks. Scruton rejects the whole idea that you can boil down political understanding to universal principles. That's a major difference.
And the relationship between libertarianism, neoliberalism, and neoconservatism, it's messy. But the encyclopedia suggests that you can see neoliberalism as basically libertarianism plus some specific economic policies. And neoconservatism, it takes elements of traditional conservatism and combines them with some libertarian ideas, especially about economics. And then you see the differences on social issues, like whether drugs should be legal or if there should be a draft. That shows how nuanced these distinctions are.
And the encyclopedia also challenges that popular idea that conservatism is all about laissez-faire capitalism. I mean, historically, conservatism has had connections to these more romanticized views of pre-industrial societies, even feudalism. And while conservatives might accept the idea of the invisible hand and they recognize that free markets can be good in some situations, they don't see it as this absolute unquestionable truth the way some classical liberals or libertarians do. Hayek's an interesting case. He tried to bring together some of that conservative skepticism with the core principles of classical liberalism.
And then the encyclopedia talks about those definitions of conservatism that focus on inequality, on how conservatism supposedly justifies existing privileges and hierarchies. They mentioned Augie and Hondrick there.
Yeah.
But then you have Quinton, and he offers a more neutral definition. He says conservatism is about the accumulated social experience of the whole community. It's a broader, less critical perspective.
And it's important to remember that conservatism isn't automatically tied to the aristocracy or opposed to democracy. Like Burke, he talked about the importance of a qualified majority. It's not just everyone, it's the people with tradition, social standing, education, property, and good character. So he was cautious about democracy, but he didn't reject it outright. And then you have the shift that some conservatives made towards neoliberal economics, and that created all these tensions and debates within the conservative movement. Thinkers like Gray, Scruton, and Harris have written about that. It shows how a conservative thought is always evolving, and sometimes it's even contradictory.
And so now that we have a better understanding of what conservatism is, we can compare it to liberalism, right? It's probably its biggest rival in post-Enlightenment thought.
Right, and the encyclopedia points out right away that liberalism and socialism, they're more theoretically complex than conservatism. And that's partly because conservatism is, well, it's suspicious of too much theorizing. And maybe there's also some historical bias in academia. They tend to favor, left-leaning perspectives. Scruton himself, he said his big book on conservatism was more like dogmatics than formal philosophy. It's almost like conservatism is more about stating its basic commitments than building these elaborate theories.
And another interesting thing is there's no real conservative theory of distributive justice, right? Like liberalism has really wrestled with that. Rawls is a good example. But conservatism, it's more focused on making sure people can pursue their own goals within a stable social order. It's not so concerned with justifying specific economic outcomes.
And to really understand the differences, it's helpful to think about how political philosophy has shifted. Ancient political philosophy, it was a lot about this idea of a natural order. But modern political philosophy, it's all about individual freedom. And the interesting thing is the encyclopedia notes that even conservatism's commitment to freedom is debated. Some people argue that its emphasis on paternalism, on authority, it clashes with that liberal standpoint of freedom. That's all about, individual autonomy, ethical individualism.
And then there's that classic distinction, right? Liberals focus on individual rights, conservatives emphasize duties and obligations, and conservatives, they really believe in obedience. They say it's essential for social cohesion, for order. Scruton and Oakeshott have made strong arguments for that. And Burke himself, he was worried about protecting the property of the few from the potential encroachment of the many.
But the encyclopedia is right to say that this contrast, it's not absolute. Western conservatives were strongly opposed to the Soviet Union, to its totalitarianism. And part of that opposition was definitely about a commitment to freedom. And Burke himself, he was wary of abstract ideals, but his goal was to make what he saw as genuine freedom better. But he wanted to do it within existing institutions. He was always careful about radical change potentially undermining that freedom. And both conservatives and classical liberals, historically, they've often agreed on things like limited government, protecting individual liberties from the state getting too powerful.
But where they really differ is on this idea of abstract universal rights, the kind that a lot of liberals champion. Conservatives see rights as embedded in specific histories, specific cultures. They're inherited, they're privileges and responsibilities. They're not just, these universal entitlements that everyone has just because they're human.
And some liberal thinkers like Hobhouse, Rawls, Dworkin, they've made really strong arguments for these abstract universal rights. But other liberals, like John Stuart Mill, they were more sensitive to history. They were influenced by conservative thinkers like Coleridge. But even Mill, in the end, he still believed in the power of reason over what Burkeans called prejudice or tradition.
And it's interesting, the encyclopedia clarifies that conservatives, they're not like strict legal positives. They don't believe that law is just whatever the sovereign says. They think there can be bad laws and that there are underlying principles of justice. Burke himself, he opposed the actions of the Stuart monarchs. And in the context of British rule in India, he actually accepted some aspects of natural law. So it's a more nuanced view than people sometimes think.
Right. So now that we've got this really thorough understanding of the core of conservatism, especially philosophically, and how it relates to liberalism, it makes sense to look at its historical development in more detail.
Yeah.